The colonel's laugh echoed through his office like a death sentence. Maya Rodriguez had endured his accusations of malingering, his dismissal of her medical needs, his assumption that she was gaming the system. But when the 26-year-old communications specialist made a decision that would expose the truth hidden beneath her uniform, one question would haunt Fort Campbell forever. How had 52 pieces of shrapnel from a Kandahar IED blast created the military's most powerful advocate for invisible wounds? Maya Rodriguez stood at attention in the crisp morning air of Fort Campbell, her uniform pressed to perfection despite the early hour. At 26, she had already earned respect among her peers as a dedicated communications specialist. But today felt different. Today, she was reporting to Colonel David Mitchell, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. The colonel's office was exactly what Maya expected. Medals lined the walls, photographs of military ceremonies covered his desk, and the American flag stood proudly in the corner. Colonel Mitchell himself was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with silver hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through everything and everyone. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said without looking up from the papers on his desk. "I've been reviewing your file. Impressive record, but I notice you've been requesting additional medical leave. Care to explain?" Maya's heart began to race. She had hoped this conversation wouldn't come so soon, but she knew it was inevitable. The recent headaches, the dizzy spells, the moments when sound seemed too loud and lights too bright, they were becoming harder to hide. Before we continue, please comment below where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe to the She Force Tales channel. "Sir, I've been experiencing some health issues that require regular medical attention," she replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. Colonel Mitchell finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "Health issues? You're 26 years old, Sergeant. What kind of health issues could a young soldier like you possibly have that require so much medical attention?" The way he said it made Maya's stomach turn. She could hear the disbelief in his voice, the assumption that she was somehow trying to avoid her duties. It was a tone she had encountered before, but never from someone so high in the chain of command. "Sir, I prefer not to discuss the specific details, but I assure you that my medical needs are legitimate and documented by the base medical staff," Maya said, maintaining her composure despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Colonel Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sergeant, I've been in the military for 34 years. I've seen soldiers try every excuse in the book to get out of their responsibilities. Young people today seem to think they can claim some mysterious ailment and get special treatment." Maya felt a flash of anger, but suppressed it quickly. "Sir, with all due respect, this is not an excuse. I take my duties seriously and have never shirked my responsibilities." "Is that so?" the colonel said, picking up her file again. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to game the system. What's next, Sergeant? Are you going to tell me you have some invisible injury from your time overseas?" The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She had indeed served overseas in Afghanistan, but she had never spoken about what happened there. The official reports were classified, and she had been instructed to keep the details confidential. Very few people knew the full story of her deployment. "Sir, I completed my overseas deployment with distinction," she said, her voice beginning to show strain. Colonel Mitchell stood up and walked around his desk, stopping just a few feet from Maya. "Let me tell you something, Sergeant. I've seen real soldiers with real injuries. I've seen men and women who've sacrificed everything for this country, and I can spot a malingerer from a mile away." Maya's hands began to tremble slightly, but she kept them clasped behind her back. The colonel's words were not just dismissive. They were insulting everything she had been through, everything she had sacrificed. "I understand your concern, sir, but I assure you that my medical needs are genuine," she repeated, though her voice was becoming quieter. "Genuine?" Colonel Mitchell laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small office. "Sergeant, you look perfectly healthy to me. You stand straight, you speak clearly, you show no obvious signs of any serious medical condition. What am I supposed to believe? That you have some secret injury that only appears when it's convenient for you?" The laugh was what broke something inside Maya. It wasn't just skeptical, it was cruel. It dismissed not only her current struggles, but also the very real trauma she carried from her service. She had been trying so hard to be professional, to handle this situation with dignity. But the colonel's attitude was making it impossible. "Sir, appearances can be deceiving," she said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "Can they now?" Colonel Mitchell returned to his chair, leaning back with an expression of smug satisfaction. "Well then, Sergeant, why don't you enlighten me? What exactly is this mysterious condition that requires so much medical attention but leaves no visible trace?" Maya stood in silence for a long moment. She knew that revealing the truth would change everything, but the colonel's dismissive attitude was pushing her toward a decision she had hoped to avoid. As the colonel continued his lecture about duty and responsibility, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She could continue to suffer in silence, accepting his dismissal and ridicule, or she could show him the truth that she had been trying so hard to keep hidden. Maya took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the conversation. Her hands moved to the collar of her uniform, and she began to unbutton it with deliberate, measured movements. Colonel Mitchell's expression shifted from smugness to confusion as he watched her actions. "Sergeant, what exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of alarm. "Sir, you said appearances can be deceiving," Maya replied, her voice now steady with resolve. "You want to see proof of my medical condition? I'm going to show you." As she opened her uniform shirt, the colonel's eyes widened in shock. Across Maya's chest and shoulder were a series of raised, twisted scars, the unmistakable marks of shrapnel wounds. The scars were extensive, creating a pattern that spoke of violence and survival. Some were small, like tiny craters in her skin, while others were longer, jagged lines that told the story of metal fragments that had torn through flesh and muscle. The silence in the room was deafening. Colonel Mitchell's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The confident, dismissive expression on his face disappeared completely, replaced by something that looked like horror and shame. "These are from an IED explosion in Helmand Province," Maya said quietly, her voice now completely calm. "4 years ago, my convoy was attacked while we were delivering communication equipment to a remote outpost. The blast killed 3 of my fellow soldiers and left me with 52 pieces of shrapnel in my body." She turned slightly, revealing more scars along her side and back. Each mark was a testament to a moment when her world had exploded into chaos, fire, and screaming metal. The colonel stared in stunned silence, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "The medical team was able to remove most of the fragments," Maya continued, "but several pieces were too close to vital organs to extract safely. They remain in my body, and sometimes they shift. When they do, I experience severe headaches, dizziness, and sometimes temporary hearing loss." Colonel Mitchell finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Sergeant, I had no idea." "No, sir, you didn't," Maya replied, beginning to button her shirt back up. "Because I don't talk about it. Because I don't use it as an excuse. Because I continue to serve despite the pain. Because this is what I chose to do with my life." The colonel's face had gone pale. He looked down at the papers on his desk, then back at Maya, as if seeing her for the first time. The transformation was remarkable. The man who had been so confident in his judgments just moments before now looked lost and uncertain. "The doctors at Walter Reed told me that I was lucky to survive," Maya said, her voice becoming stronger. "They told me that most people with injuries like mine don't make it off the battlefield. But I did. And when I recovered enough to return to duty, I chose to come back because I believe in serving my country." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. "The medical appointments you questioned are necessary to monitor the remaining fragments. Sometimes they shift, and when they do, it can be dangerous. The doctors need to track their movement to ensure they don't migrate to more critical areas." Colonel Mitchell stood up slowly, his movements uncertain. He walked to the window and stared out at the base, his hands clasped behind his back. Maya could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he carried himself differently now than he had just minutes before. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said finally, not turning around, "why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" "Sir, my medical information is private. I didn't feel it was necessary to share the details of my injuries to justify legitimate medical appointments. Additionally, much of what happened during that deployment is classified, and I was instructed to limit discussion of the specifics." The colonel turned back to face her, and Maya could see that his entire demeanor had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology, Sergeant. A profound apology." Maya remained at attention, though her posture had relaxed slightly. "Sir, I understand that you were concerned about soldiers potentially abusing the medical system. That's a legitimate concern for a commanding officer." "No," Colonel Mitchell said firmly, shaking his head. "There's no excuse for what I just did." The first change came within days. Colonel Mitchell personally visited the base medical facility to meet with the doctors and nurses who treated soldiers with service-connected conditions. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the chief medical officer, later told Maya that it was one of the most productive conversations she had ever had with a commanding officer. The colonel asked detailed questions about invisible injuries. Dr. Martinez explained during one of Maya's routine appointments. He wanted to understand everything from traumatic brain injuries to chronic pain conditions to PTSD. He took notes like he was studying for a final exam. Dr. Martinez checked the latest scan showing the location of the shrapnel fragments still in Maya's body. He also asked specifically about your case, Sergeant Rodriguez. He wanted to understand exactly what you deal with on a daily basis, so he could better support you and others in similar situations. Maya felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. While she appreciated the colonel's efforts, she still wasn't entirely comfortable being the center of so much attention. "I just hope this helps other soldiers, ma'am." "Oh, it already has," Dr. Martinez assured her. "We've had 5 soldiers come in this week for appointments they had been putting off because they were afraid of how their commanders would react." Word is getting around that Colonel Mitchell is genuinely supportive of soldiers seeking medical care. As the weeks passed, the mandatory training sessions that Colonel Mitchell had promised became a reality. Maya was asked to participate as a guest speaker, sharing her story with officers and senior NCOs from across the base. The first session was terrifying, standing in front of a room full of senior military personnel and talking about her injuries felt like exposing her deepest vulnerabilities, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Major Jessica Torres, a company commander, approached Maya after the presentation with tears in her eyes. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology. I have a soldier in my unit who's been requesting frequent medical appointments, and I've been giving her a hard time about it. After hearing your story, I realize I may have been making her situation much worse." Captain Anthony Garcia, a veteran of multiple deployments, shared his own struggles with hearing loss from repeated exposure to explosions. "I've been denying that I have a problem for years," he admitted. "But listening to you talk about facing your injuries head-on has made me realize that I need to get help." The training sessions became so popular that Colonel Mitchell expanded them to include enlisted personnel at all levels. Maya found herself becoming an unofficial advocate for soldiers with invisible injuries, a role she had never expected but found deeply fulfilling. One afternoon, a young private named David Kim approached her after a training session. He was barely 19, fresh out of basic training, but there was something in his eyes that looked much older. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said quietly, "I was in a convoy that hit an IED during my first deployment. I wasn't physically injured, but ever since then, I've been having nightmares and panic attacks. I've been too scared to tell anyone because I didn't want them to think I was weak." Maya sat down with Private Kim and spent an hour talking to him about PTSD, about the importance of seeking help, and about the fact that invisible wounds were just as real and deserving of treatment as physical ones. By the end of their conversation, he had agreed to make an appointment with the base mental health services. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said as he prepared to leave. "I feel like I can breathe again for the first time in months." Meanwhile, Colonel Mitchell was undergoing his own transformation. He began making regular visits to the medical facility, not to check up on soldiers, but to learn more about their conditions and needs. He established an open-door policy specifically for soldiers dealing with medical issues, and he made it clear that seeking medical care would never be held against anyone in their performance evaluations. One day, Colonel Mitchell called Maya into his office again. This time, the atmosphere was completely different, warm and supportive rather than hostile and suspicious. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I have some good news," he said with a smile. "Your application for Officer Candidate School has been approved. Congratulations." Maya felt her heart race with excitement. "Thank you, sir. I am honored." "You've earned it," the colonel replied. "Your leadership during this entire process has been exemplary. You've turned a difficult situation into an opportunity to help your fellow soldiers, And that's exactly the kind of officer the Army needs. As Maya's departure for officer candidate school approached, the changes she had helped initiate at Fort Campbell began to take on a life of their own. What had started as one colonel's awakening had grown into a base-wide transformation in how service-connected medical conditions were understood and supported. Colonel Mitchell, Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hayes began, her tone serious but not unfriendly. I've been hearing remarkable things about the initiatives you've implemented regarding support for soldiers with service-connected medical conditions. Ma'am, the credit really belongs to Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Mitchell said. Her courage in sharing her story opened my eyes to problems I didn't even know existed. Maya felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. She had never intended for her personal situation to become a model for other military installations, but she was gratified to know that other soldiers might benefit from what had happened. General Hayes, Colonel Mitchell said, I believe this program could be implemented Army-wide. The training materials we've developed could be easily adapted for other commands. 2 years later, Second Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez stood in a conference room at the Pentagon, addressing a group of senior military officials from all branches of the armed forces. The room was filled with generals, admirals, and senior civilians from the Department of Defense, all gathered to hear about the success of the Invisible Wounds initiative that she and Colonel Mitchell had developed. The program had exceeded every expectation. Ladies and gentlemen, Maya began, her voice confident and clear. When we started this program at Fort Campbell, we had one simple goal: to create an environment where soldiers felt safe seeking the medical care they needed. Today, I'm pleased to report that we've achieved that goal and much more. As Maya concluded her presentation and looked out at the faces of senior military leaders who were now committed to supporting soldiers with invisible wounds, she touched her chest where, beneath her dress uniform, the scars from that IED explosion remained. They were no longer sources of shame or pain, but reminders of her resilience and symbols of hope for countless others who carried their own invisible wounds. The shrapnel that still moved within her body occasionally, causing the headaches and dizziness that had started this entire journey, seemed less like a burden now and more like a reminder of her purpose. Every twinge of pain connected her to the millions of service members who needed someone to advocate for them, someone who understood their struggles from the inside.